So let's get right into it. Just want to cover a story done by Indian news channel showing the French hosting a bunch of Ukrainian soldiers and just some of their Nazi paraphernalia. Let's just get right into it. So here in the background you see a bunch of Nazis from Ukraine. And you wonder why they like these people so much. So let's just go through the story. It's a Nazi flag in the background, obviously. You can see so here you can see the Nazi Ukrainian flags, Ukrainian soldiers, and then you can see them holding a yellow and blue Ukrainian flag with the Nazi emblems all over it. Yeah, so let's just go through this and then I'll come back. Stand by. So here in this photo from the store, you see in the upper left corner, you see Ukrainians with the Nazi tattoos, the SS stormtrooper tattoos. All these are leaked images from a 2023 where the Ukrainians were hosted in France. So it just goes to show that the French are basically nothing but Nazis as well. You know, Operation Paperclip, Operation Gladio. I'll go over that at the end of this vlog. Stand by. So here in the story, they talked about the Germans who they didn't want the heat. They like to keep their Nazi stuff undercover, but they had some Ukrainians that were training with them. As you can see, they had 7 Ukrainians they expelled during a training mission in Germany who were caught with Nazi symbols on their uniforms, and the Germans didn't want the bad press. The original, you know, some of the original, well, the Americans are the original Nazis, but the German Nazi branch didn't want the bad press at the moment, so they got rid of the Ukrainian Nazis who were running around and training with, as you can see, Nazi emblems on their uniforms. Stand by. And here you can see them sporting, again, the Nazi flag, Ukrainian flags with French weapons during the training with the French. So here you can see pictures of what's called the Azov battalion, extremist Nazi organization out of the Russian capital, out of the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. So that's a picture of some of the Azov battalions with their Nazi flags. Stand by. So here you see more training pictures with Ukrainian soldiers with Nazi insignias on their uniform. So you have to understand who Congress is giving these tens of billions of dollars to, right? They're giving it to Nazis because, well, they're keeping it in the family, right? Stand by. So in the story, they also report that some of Kiev's units are made up exclusively of Nazis. See? Now, so you have to understand the connections here, right? So they have the different branches of the Nazis. Now, who is led, as you can see, Vladimir Zelensky, right? Who is the president of Ukraine, supposedly a Jewish person. You say, well, what's the connection between a bunch of Nazis and this Jewish guy? I thought that they were in opposition to each other. That would not be true. You don't understand, right? So if you look at what's happening in Gaza and Palestine, it's a total Nazi operation, right? If you look at what's happening in Ukraine, it's a total Nazi operation. And so therein you have, and who is the head of both operations? A Zio-Nazi, right? You have a Nazi, Zelensky, a Zio-Nazi in charge of the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and then you have the Nazis in Israel in charge of the operation in Palestine and in North Africa. You have to understand, it's a North African, Israel is a North African Nazi operation. Let me say that again. Israel is a North African Nazi operation. You see? What is a Nazi? A Nazi is a fascist white supremacist. What is a fascist? A fascist is basically what you have when you have uh, a combination of government and corporations, right? Government, corporate entities. You see, where you have integrated together, and then the Nazi element is just the white supremacist, racist, terroristic element that's mixed in. You see, into one group. So that's what a Nazi is, and so that's what you have. What do you see in Israel? You see a colonial Nazi, white supremacist, racist operation attacking the indigenous people to put a colony project there to destabilize. Where is Israel? It's on the border of Egypt. What is Egypt? Egypt is an African country that was invaded by Arabs. You see? And invaded by Arabs and white people. You see? And so you have it. That is a total Nazi operation. And regardless of the propaganda, and it's about to explode. And so and it's biblical, you see? Because the Bible is an African book. It's not has nothing to do with Catholicism and all the stuff that they, bastardize and plagiarize from the Bible. But that's another story. So, to stay on task. And so if you look, you say, well, look at the connections. You have to connect the dots. Zelensky, a so-called Jewish man, and Netanyahu, a so-called, Jewish man, both in charge. And where are they in charge? Well, Zelensky, the so-called Jewish man, is in charge in Ukraine. Right? Connect the dots. He's a Jewish man. Most of the people that in his army are Nazis. You see? It is even said by this Indian newspaper, Indian media outlet, it is even said some units of Kiev's army are made up exclusively of Nazis. That means entirely. Meaning Zelensky is leading an army in his capital full of Nazis. You see? I didn't make this up. This is a known fact. Look it up. You see? So you have a so-called Jewish man who you think is opposed to Nazism, but is really a Nazi. Because Jewish is what? Is it a race? No, it's not. Jewish is a religion. So the fight between the white Nazi and the white Jew is basically a religious beef. You see, it's a civil war. It's based to say, like, Baptist, white Baptist and white Protestant, who's going to be in charge? Right? So white Christian and white Jew, who's going to be in charge? So when you see that opposition between them two, it's not based on race. It's based on more so you would consider a religious, cultural difference, but ethnically or racially, these are the same people. That's why they don't allow DNA tests in Israel. You see? So you look at the connection. You have a white Jewish man in charge in Ukraine and a white Jewish man in charge in Israel. And what do you have? World War III, the synagogue of Satan. Right? Revelations 2 and 9. I know the blasphemy of those which say they are Jews and are not, but are actually the synagogue of Satan. You see? So therefore you have the connection right there. The Jewish man in charge of Ukraine, the Jewish man in charge of the state of Israel, and you have a bunch of Nazis everywhere. You have basically, what are you witnessing in Israel? Well, you're witnessing the ethnic cleansing, just like the Indians in the United States, or South Africa, or black people in South Africa, or black people in Australia. This is their pattern. It said, what does the Bible say? By their fruit you shall know them. Well, this is their fruit. This is what they do everywhere. The fruit drops off the tree. You see? The tree gives forth the same fruit everywhere. Right? By your fruit you shall know them. Right? And so what is it that they do? They do the same thing everywhere. So the pattern in Palestine is the pattern of Africa, is the pattern of America, the Indians and the blacks, is the same pattern everywhere. Australia, right? The same pattern in, pick a spot and throw a dart at it on the map, and it's the same pattern, right? And so you see the pattern between the Israel and the connection between Israel and Ukraine, and then what do you see coming out of that? You see World War III, right? With these same people involved and in charge, and then who's backing them up? Who's backing Ukraine? Well, we can start there. Who's backing Ukraine? Well, that would be the United States and NATO and all of the white European countries. You see, what are they doing? Funding by the tens of billions of dollars a bunch of Nazis, right? This is without question. And who are they bombing? They're bombing one of the only groups of white people that fought against the Nazis, right? Matter of fact, they're bombing. Who are they bombing? Let's make the connection. Let's connect the dots. They're bombing and fighting the group of white people that are against what their colonial Nazi projects and have always been against it. Who would that be? That would be the Russians, who lost 27 million soldiers and defeated the Nazis. That's who defeated the Nazis. That's why they're fighting the Russians using the Ukrainians, right? You got to understand. So you must understand that, to understand how this whole thing connects, you have to connect the dots. You have to understand that the Amero-Nazi, the Amero-Nazi, and the Euro-Nazi, they were against Adolf Hitler because he went off script. You have to understand that, to understand what's going on right now in 2024. That he went off script, so they had to bring him back in line with the script. And now, Operation Paperclip, Operation Gladio. What is Operation Paperclip and Operation Gladio? Operation Paperclip was when what was left of the Nazi scientists came to the United States, and Gladio was basically the rest of the Nazis that were reintegrated into Europe and also Israel and Ukraine, etc. You see, so Ukraine is Operation Gladio. That was the integration of the Nazi, dispersal back in the Europe and North Africa, and Operation Paperclip was the dispersal of what the U.S. Amero-Nazi wanted of his brethren back into the United States, right? And so you have to understand, to connect the dots, that now you see them pushing back against who? The only group that oppose the Nazi, actually oppose the Nazi and Nazism. That would be Russians. You have to connect the dots. You have to understand. The only group that opposed them and that defeated the Nazis was the Russians, not the Americans or the Europeans. They assisted, but the Russians, the Holocaust was against the Russians, not the white Euro-Jew Nazi, right? That was the Civil War. The Russians were the ones who defeated the Nazis and drove their ass back to Germany and held Germany until the 1990s. Until they gave it back in the 90s when Reagan said, Gorbachev, tear down the wall. This is how strong the Russians were. They lost 27 million people to fighting the Nazi. That's why they want them gone. You gotta understand that. That's why they want the Russians gone. Because they hurt their cause. They won't get on board with their cause. Their true agenda. Right? And so you have to understand, to make sense of this, what's going on, why is World War III about to happen? And So this story exposes some of that. I mean, I made this longer than I wanted to, but I wanted to hash out. You have to connect the dots. So when people say it's not possible for Nazis to be in Ukraine or in America or Europe, or the Israelis are not Nazis, the Israelis are 100% Nazis. The Ukrainians are 100% Nazis. I met a couple of them. Every Ukrainian I met was a Nazi. I met one who claimed he was a pastor of a church. He was a straight up Nazi racist. Trust me, it's not hyperbole. Every one of these people are Nazis. The modern Nazi exists. This is what every part of what they're doing is just to refurbish themselves and rehash themselves and reinvent themselves in a way that works with the plan. And the plan is they have to get rid of any groups that oppose the Nazis. Who would that be? Well, in North Africa, that would be pretty much the Iranian, Syrians, and the Palestinians and the Lebanese. They oppose the Nazis there, so they have to get rid of them. In Europe, the only group that really oppose them is the Russians and those that side with the Russians. So they have to finally get rid of them. The final solution, as Hitler said, they have to execute the final solution. In places like America, you notice that what's going on where they're bringing all of these hostile immigrants into these black neighborhoods. Why? Because no matter how downtrodden the Negro in America is, and how beaten and how perverted and degenerated he is, at a certain level, he would probably revolt against the Nazi. You see, once they start crushing them, you know, in the final solution, as Hitler called it. So they bring in these hostile Nazi immigrant groups and putting them in, setting them up in near and adjacent to these black neighborhoods. Why? Because they can flip them, because they're anti-blacks. They very easily flip them, do them favors, and empower them, and turn them into militia groups to then ethnically cleanse the indigenous so-called black population in the United States. They're henchmen of sorts, right? They would be their henchmen of sorts. So, and all that's just being, all of these dominoes are being put in place. You have to understand how this is working. You have to take a bird's eye view from 5,000 feet in the air and then look down on history. And then you'll understand what they're doing. And so that's why you see all these Nazis everywhere and this cooperation. They're all one group. The white Jew, not the white Jew is a Nazi, just like the white American is Nazi, and the white Euro Nazi. The only ones generally are the Russians, who you find are not. Are not necessarily, certain aspects of the Russian are Nazis and certain aspects are not. The modern Russian. Because of their heritage and how many of them they kill, they fight against, most of them will fight against Nazism. Not that they not that they're for integration with black people or anything like that. It's just what happened to their grandparents and how harshly they were treated by the Euro-Nazi, their brethren, the Euro-Nazi. They, a lot of them are still against them. And so that's what you see happening now. I don't want to make this too long, but this story, I wanted to cover, when I saw the story, I wanted to cover and kind of break down what you see going on. This is how we see coming into view how this is going to play out in the next few months, right? How is this going to play out? So you see like how basically the breakdown of the plan of the Nazis, the Fourth Reich, or the third, rehashing of the Third Reich, how they plan to implement their final solution onto the people they see as the outgroup or the bottom caste. How they want to, how they're gonna finally crush the bottom caste, and the groups that they're gonna use. And so you see that it's going. They're making a final push, so they're gonna get quite desperate, and that's what's gonna cause World War III. So I'm gonna wrap this, but you can see they're gonna get quite desperate. They're getting quite desperate in their efforts in Ukraine, and also they see they're getting quite desperate in their efforts in the Middle East, and in America as well. And so because of this, they're setting up. They're setting things up to implement, right, a solution. You have to understand they're setting up to implement a solution to their problems, and it's going to lead to obviously World War III, because the Russians are not gonna. They say the Russians are bluffing. They say that the Russians are bluffing. They think that the Arab coalition, the Muslim Islamic coalitions, are splintered and bluffing, etc., etc. We'll see. I don't think so. I think that as they make their final push, and they lose, power politically. Like for instance, in the United States, the blacks are going to push back against, once they see, now that they see the total hostility of the programs that are being rolled out with these people coming across the border, they're going to start to push back, and politically, that's going to create pressure in the United States, which is going to lead to a civil war, starting in black neighborhoods with these militia groups, these illegal immigrant militia groups that are being formed, to ethnically cleanse the blacks there, control, counter, ethnically cleanse, etc. And then same thing with the pressure you see in Russia, and the pressure you see in North Africa and Middle East. So as all those pressures come to bear, and the Nazis start to basically be pushed back upon, for every action there's a reaction. So they're going to get desperate. Like Netanyahu's they're putting pressure on him to pull back. Well, that's not going to work. There may be political pressure in the U.S. where the policies, they push back on those policies through the elections and start to fall apart. A splintering of the blacks, Trumpians, all this kind of thing, Democrats, all that shit splits off. So you're going to have groups, the groups in power, the Nazis, basically getting very desperate. And as they get desperate, the more desperate they get, the more horrible they get, and then the miscalculations begin, and then you are going to quickly descend into World War III. As you're going to see civil war slowly ramp up through civil wars, through political dissension, through civil war, and then world war, as you see happening everywhere throughout North Africa, the Middle East, the Balkans in Europe, on the Russian border, and in the United States. Places like the United States, where you'll see, the elections the election turmoil. You'll start to see the civil wars breaking out, the fights and skirmishes within the United States. And so it'll slowly start to spread. And at the core of the whole situation is the final solution by the Nazis. This is basically a final Nazi push to consolidate power that's going to fail. Right? It's going to fail. It didn't fail. Like, people think the Nazis failed I'm going to say this a minute ago. In World War II, they say, the Nazis failed. That's not true. What you saw in World War II, you have to understand, was a Nazi civil war. It was a civil war, basically. You see? And so, where the Nazis were prepared to work with the Russians because they had a rogue faction within the Nazis where it became very powerful in Adolf Hitler. And they wanted to use, it's sort of like the enemy of the, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think that's how it goes. So even though they didn't like the Russians, they wanted to use the Russians against the rogue faction of the Nazis, which was the Hitler faction. And then when he failed, when they were able to use the Russians to counter them, they wanted to reconsolidate and then turn around and get rid of the Russians and everyone else that they wanted to get rid of. Once they brought the Germans back under control, the German-led faction of the Nazi Party back under control, because they wanted a more or less volatile sort of left-wing Nazism, as opposed to a right-wing, open extermination program, colonization. They wanted to pull back from because they figured it wouldn't work, the open air, slaving extermination program, ethnic cleansing world, white supremacist ethnic cleansing program. So they wanted to pull back from that. The Hitler, branch, they did not. They wanted to accelerate it. And any groups that opposed them, the Hitler branch of the Nazis wanted to basically kill and subjugate. At that time, the white Jewish, Nazi branches wanted to run their own program. And that's when they bumped heads with the, white Anglo-Saxon, and that whole thing kicked off. So you must understand how this whole thing played out. If you're not a student of history, of deep diving into history, you have no idea what's going on right now. Right? You don't understand how, and then when you got people who, you're trying to connect the Bible and end times prophecy and history and geopolitics, and you have no understanding of any of these things. You have no deep understanding. All you know is basically propaganda and half-truths, right? You haven't really spent any time, because you're not passionate about it, studying any of these subjects in length, so you can't connect the dots. But this is what I've laid out here is the actual, just years of study. And then as you look at these current geopolitical events, you can see how they fit, all the pieces fit together. And now we're in the end game. So I'm gonna leave it there. That's all I got.